everyone, and welcome to the Psyched to Practice podcast, your one-stop for practical and useful clinical information, masterful insight from experts in the field, and a guide to daily living. I'm your host, Paul Wagner, and joining me is
Ray Christner.
And today we have a Living Psyched episode for you, focusing a bit on this idea of conflict resolution and, wondering, Ray, after kind of going through and recording it, what are your thoughts? Like, how do you feel like it went?
Yeah, I think it's a topic we probably could have spent probably 2 episodes on because it's such a big kind of complex topic. But yeah, it was, I think, intriguing to kind of go through and talk about different aspects that might contribute to conflict and also some just simple strategies to think about in order to resolve those things that just happen in our daily lives. When I was thinking back on the episode for, one of the things that you had said in the episode was we were talking about the benefits of conflict, and you said conflict can be functional. And I think that's an important part because, I think it is a functional aspect of our life. I don't know anybody that's gone through life conflict free, that they never have any to resolve. There is a functional piece to it. And when we know how to resolve it, we increase the functionality of conflict. Like, conflict can be a good thing. It helps reinforce our relationships. It helps doing all these things. So I in a topic that sounds like it's dealing with negative situations, I do think it's important to keep in mind that conflict's not inherently bad, and we need it, and we need to know how to deal with it effectively. So I thought a good takeaway for me. How about for you?
I think something that stood out for me was, the importance of having a common goal when we're engaging in conflict resolution, but also being flexible enough for ourselves that if the resolution isn't able to happen, if the individual isn't willing to be an active participant, the idea of having a personal goal and how those two can differ. But, I think starting off with the best of intentions to talking about like what would a common goal for resolution look like? But having a backup plan just in case.
Yeah. We don't know how it's going to work out. And, it's important to, almost have an exit strategy. Yeah. I think that's the way to look at it. But, for all of you listening, as always, we'd love to hear from you. If you have comments or maybe thoughts on the episode and maybe things we didn't cover that might help people who are working with conflict resolution, please make some comments on our social media or be in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you.
And with that, we hope you enjoy this Living Psyched episode, opening up a can of conflict resolution. Hey, Ray, we're here with another Living Psyched episode, today focusing on conflict resolution. And, I can't think of maybe a more universal experience to talk about for today.
Yeah, I think we all have conflict. And I think we've said this before. I think over the last few years, maybe people have experienced increased conflict because of, a number of things that are just happening. So, I think it's interesting to talk about maybe some ways to think about conflict and some strategies to use to, we're going to use the word resolve, but how do we deal with it, I guess, is, because sometimes maybe we may not get the resolution we want. So how do we deal with that part of it?
Absolutely. And I think, an important part of talking about this is, to your point there, I think conflict resolution, as we're talking about it needs to involve more than one person. And right. So there isn't necessarily a conflict resolution in the way that we're framing it that only one individual can do alone in isolation. Doesn't mean that we need active participation from everyone, and we'll kind of get to that. But I think, there needs to be more than one, at least involved in this process as we're talking about it.
Yeah. And I really, I talk to a lot of people about this idea that while we want to have a resolution, when we can't come to a mutual resolution, there are ways to resolve the conflict for ourselves.
Yeah.
And, again, that might not be ideal, but we have to still come to some form of resolution. So we're not harboring some resentment or it's affecting us in other ways that, I don't want to say just let it go, but I think at times we have to find a way. How do we get to a resolution that we can let it go a little bit and at least to move forward? And
I think that's the biggest piece when it comes down to conflict resolution is the ability to move on from the conflict or maybe multiple conflicts here, but that ability to not stay stuck and rooted in one place, because I do think that that's where resentment grows, or that's where, we end up engaging in some of these maladaptive actions and behaviors that maybe just feed the conflict rather than, working to allow us, just as individuals to take a deep breath and move on from it and not letting it then shade the rest of our day or even shading, just the way that we view a certain person or a certain situation.
Yeah. And I'm going to use the word instead of moving on, moving forward.
Yes.
And the reason I'm going to use that is, I often say that word because I think moving on, people sometimes think it's just, okay, we're not going to come to a solution. And so we're just going to move on. But when we do that, and I know this is semantics, but I think when we think of it in that way, my concern is that's when later on we're still bitter about a conflict. Mm-hmm. And man, how toxic is it? If we just keep harboring these things. When I use the word moving forward, is that I think when we move forward, it indicates us that we have come to some resolution. Again, maybe not the one we want, maybe not the ideal, but we don't just say, oh, it happened, forget about it. We at least in our mind come to some way of resolving it or accepting it, or from our past episodes, or we've problem solved around it. And then we kind of go on to what else is happening in life. So, I think the key is conflicts happen. So we have to figure out what steps we can take.
And, maybe it helps out, Ray, what do you think are the different, let's just say general types of conflicts that occur, whether it's someone that we're talking to in session or something that we see, in our personal lives, but what do you think are generally some of the conflicts that are experienced?
I don't even know where to begin.
I think, put on the spot.
Yeah, I think that I think of conflicts as such, a spectrum of situations, right? When I drove in here today, I had somebody pull out in front of me. For a moment, that was a conflict. Maybe not a conflict that's going to bother me all day, but it was a form of conflict. I could have excelled that conflict if I wanted, and that could have gone a whole bunch of different directions. Yeah. We've heard about those. So I think sometimes conflicts can start with even just general, for lack of a better word, slights that can happen. And whether they're accidents or not, they're things that we could escalate. I think there's conflicts in the workplace, whether it's just disagreements. And when we talk about conflicts, I think the other part of this is, doesn't mean we're yelling and screaming at each other. A disagreement, viewing things two different ways, is a conflict that we sometimes have to resolve. Partners and kids. I think we see them in a bunch of different ways. But I view it as, it can be something as a simple disagreement to an all-out battle where we're both, almost like the Hatfield and McCoy kind of
Yes.
feud. That's a conflict. We can go to that level. So I view it as there's so many different levels. What's your take?
I try to categorize. I like the idea of a spectrum, but I think I typically try to categorize it as, and throwing in these terms of active conflict versus passive conflict, or one-sided conflict versus, if there's more than one person involved, is each person playing taking an actionable step in the conflict, where the person who pulled out in front of you, did they know that they pulled out in front of you, right, or did they, were you in their blind spot and they just completely missed it? That then feels to me like a one-sided conflict. You're experiencing the conflict. They're blissfully unaware.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes, that's going to be a different approach to resolution than if, I'm looking and I see you and I'm like, watch this. And,
right.
I pull out in front of you intentionally. That's going to, we might not always have all that information, but I think the roles that individuals play within the conflicts end up being a very important piece when we're talking about how to resolve it. Because, if we're jumping ahead a little bit, one person says, I don't even see what the big deal is. Like, why are we doing this? That might feel like it's more one-sided for the person that says, this is a really big deal to me. And how can you not see it? And, so that's going to be different from, I know what I'm doing is upsetting them, but I think it's important that I'm doing this anyway for myself. We're going to take two different approaches then when we're talking about resolution.
So you mentioned the one-sided conflict. We have the two-sided conflict. What else? Is there anything else that you look at it beyond that?
I think I use that term like, active and passive. And I think that a part of the passive is just things that are happening around us that are creating, and I almost to define conflict, I think of it as like this friction, and it just doesn't allow us to move forward smoothly. We're not in agreement or in congruence with the world around us or with the people around us, and they're sticking points. Yeah. And too much friction, we're going to stop, or at least we're going to, get a friction burn. It's going to hurt a little bit. And wanting to see like, okay, I'll use the example again, the person who pulled out, probably not the biggest friction point, a slight annoyance or frustration, a moment of conflict, but then being able to distance. That's not a resolved conflict though, because that other person, you weren't able to pull over and you and this person have a heart to heart and like, walking away and be like, I'm so sorry I didn't see you there, So that's one that I do think we're just moving forward from, that we're really not then seeing a resolution, but that can be okay. But I think looking at the relationship too. So the people that we're involved with, and I think the people we're closest with most often is where we have the hardest conflicts to resolve. I think in part because we just the frequency, we're with them more often. We have more exposure to them. There's going to be more points when we're not in congruence with them. And so I think that also plays a role in this. I talked about the one side and two side. I think also willingness to engage in conflict resolution is another big thing. If someone says, I don't care, that's going to be much more different, and you kind of mentioned that a bit, but I think that's going to be another dynamic that we have to take into consideration when we're thinking about this construct of conflict resolution.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that I agree. And I want to kind of add to you, you talk about like family and people we're close with. I think there's a context in conflict. The conflict I would have with a stranger who looked at me and called me a jerk is going to be more intense than if my best friend looked at me and called me a jerk, because I may perceive it differently. Mm-hmm. So I mean, I think with when I say context, I think how we perceive it, even to a point of it's interesting. I'll go back to this simple thing of somebody pulling out in front of me. My perception in that conflict would change if maybe it was a 16-year-old who did it, or maybe it was an older lady who did it. Maybe it was a priest in the car and I saw, he was wearing a black shirt and a collar. Like, it's interesting. I think that when we think of conflicts and how we perceive them, there's so many variables that come into play. Like, while theoretically we try to make them nice and neat, they're not. There's so many things that come in, and our perception to the conflict and how we're going to handle it. I even see it in myself, and I think sometimes in conflicts, my conflict might be more intense with my own kids that I'm trying to make a point than it would be to someone else. Mm-hmm. I might stand a different ground with them. I think there's just so many variables that come into play. And, not that we have to think of all of them, but we at least have to be, aware and say, okay, how am I handling this? Would I handle it different with someone else? Would I deal with a coworker different than my boss or whatever it might be. Knowing that and paying attention to how we're approaching the resolution, I think is important.
And I think one of the other pieces is not only our perception of, who's engaging with it, but also like, I know it's not this black and white, but the idea of if it's a perception-based conflict or a consequence-based conflict. And so, this is one of the first thoughts that comes to mind. Intention, I think, has a lot to do with just a perception-based conflict. If your friend says you're a jerk, that's perception-based. Right. If my friend backed into my car, there's a consequence. And so, maybe it was hey, I was just joking around. I didn't mean to back into your car. Intention's great, but because of the consequence, we can't rely on intention alone.
Right.
Where if it's just I'm messing around, I'm calling someone a jerk, and they, if they're starting to get upset with that, we can resolve that more easily through understanding the perception. So I think recognizing, when there's an action to it or when there's a specific consequence to it, that's going to have a different role than when it's just a perception-based one as well.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, So I mean, the idea of conflict is really a complex piece,
yes,
and I'm going to throw another twist to it. I think conflict is good sometimes, and I think it's just as problematic to avoid conflicts. Now, again, defining the word conflict, that doesn't mean we're yelling and screaming at each other. That's not always good conflict, but I think a lot of times people work so hard to avoid conflict and they miss the benefit from it. And I'm going to kind of do a flashback to, one of our first episodes when Ro Minuti was on and we were talking about relationships and, part of this idea that in good relationships, we have conflicts, we have ruptures that happen in relationships, and our relationships grow on how we resolve them. And so not that I want to argue with my wife, but I do think that at times having conflicts and not just agreeing with each other all the time, there's a healthy part of that. Like we shouldn't try to avoid conflicts. We should learn how to respect each other in conflicts and resolve them the right way. Same with friends. I mean, I'm lucky. I have friends that think so many different ways. And there's a lot of times I don't agree with any of them. I mean, especially if, politics come up or something like that. But I respect them enough that we can have a conflict and a disagreement and still be friends and still resolve it and still respect each other at the end of the day. And our relationships are better because of the conflicts. So, a lot of times we hear conflict and we just think it's this bad thing. And I, again, throwing more complexity to the conversation, I don't think they always are. I think there is room for healthy disagreement and how we manage ourselves and work through those situations. At the end of the day, good resolution to conflict builds, I think, stronger people. And I think it can be a positive thing. I started off saying, wow, we've all had all this conflict kind of lately, in the last few years. I think where it's got out of control is we stopped resolving it well. Mm-hmm. We just kind of go, screw you. If you think this way, I'm not going to be involved. And we just separate. And so we rupture and we don't connect. And, when we started coming up with this idea of talking about conflict resolution, the reason I think it's so important is when we do it well, it helps build better connectedness to people. And I love the fact that I can give an opinion to my friend and they can disagree and we can have an argument and we can have a healthy kind of debate. At the end of the day, we're still okay. We're still strong together. And I know that's different than stranger conflict, like if it's with a friend, or with someone else. But I think even in those situations, we can handle ourselves in a way that it helps our interaction with other people. So a twist to conflict. Maybe it's not all bad.
It's an opportunity for growth. And
right.
Yeah. Absolutely. And as you were bringing up Roman Nudi's episode, that sparked my thought into our attachment theory episode. And, one of the measures of secure attachment is the ability to have conflict and not then feeling an overwhelming urge or fear that either we're needing to distance ourselves due to that conflict or to, smother the person, but rather a conflict can exist in the trust that we'll be able to resolve it. And so I guess what we're really talking about is, not necessarily how to stop having conflict, but how to let conflict be functional. And that's the goal. Is like, how can we let conflict be functional for us?
I love that term. I think that's a great way to think about it, right? It is a part of life, and we can have functional growth producing conflict. I like that reframe. That's a great way to look at it.
So maybe let's get into talking a little bit about the different types of conflict resolution that we're talking about. And I think that, for the simplicity's sake of this episode and not to, go down every nuanced path, let's maybe divide it up into when, maybe first talking about when individuals are willing to come to the table and willing to interact and engage with one another. How do we help support conflict resolution then? And then maybe we'll get to if there's really only one party who's wanting to be involved in conflict resolution, and how can we kind of create a different perception of what resolution is. But, when both are willing to come to the table, but they're struggling with resolving it, like, what are your thoughts there, Ray? Like, how do you approach that?
Well, I mean, I think it goes back to probably the most basic thing that we kind of utilize. And I think that's just the idea of listening. I think if we're going to start with figuring out how to resolve anything, whether it's stranger or friend, we really have to listen to that other side. And, I tell people all the time, and I fall into this trap as well. There's so many times that when we're in a conflict, while somebody's talking, we're trying to think of our response and rebuttal rather than really listening to what they're saying. And it's something I try to attend to all the time. And I catch myself where I'm like, okay, wait a second, they're talking and I'm thinking of my answer or how I'm going to get back at them versus really listening and going, okay, do I really understand their side of this? And it's kind of interesting I think just in my personal experience, that simple piece of just going, okay, let me unconditionally, reflectively listen to this person and really try to understand what they're saying, how much that by itself changes how I engage in the conflict. So I think skill number one is if both people are at the table, both people have to listen to each other.
And I think that is such a helpful tool. And regardless, I said if it's a perception-based or a consequence-based conflict, I think that skill alone helps out with both immensely. I think it goes a bit further with just a perception-based conflict because we still have to deal with the consequence. But if we can have a level of understanding, and actually, I guess listening and understanding aren't necessarily the same thing, but we need one. I think we need really good listening skills to have a really good understanding of something because, we're perceiving beings. And so we're not going to be omnipotent. We're not going to be able to say, oh, I don't need to listen, but I know exactly what this person says, or I know exactly what this person means with this, but being able to hear the nuances in it. And I think a really valuable thing, and the term I use with it is active listening. And it's the ability to share back, so accurately what you're hearing back to the other person that you're like, yes, you get it. That's exactly what I mean. And that's exactly where I'm coming from with this. And if you can get to that point, not when, not like a sarcastic, oh, yep, nope, you hit the nail on the head. It's not that response, but it's you captured my point. You captured my view. You were listening and you were able to share that back with me. I hear that as listening and understanding. And then I think if one person can do that, it opens up the door to allow the other person to attempt that as well. And so, in the sessions, I practice that a lot. For me personally, I try to practice that a lot. If I'm engaged, if I'm in a conflict, can I share back what I'm hearing and how does that match up? And if it doesn't match up, can I take another pass until we're or at least have the same congruent understanding of what the situation is for one another.
Yeah. And I think that active listening, when you feel, if you're one of the parties that somebody listens in that active way and you feel like you're understood, it kind of tampers that intensity of the conflict going up. Even if you haven't come to a resolution, I think that just hearing that somebody say, so this is what you're saying, and there's that piece of just feeling understood. Yeah, it lessens our ability to want to fight back necessarily, like fight back at least in a harsh way. And I think we can use that in a lot of. I think that's such a powerful tool, not in just conflicts, even with relationships. I have a patient of mine that just had an odd situation where was sitting at a stoplight and the guy behind him fell asleep at the wheel. They were sitting, stopped, fell asleep, let his foot off the brake and bumped his car, cracked, the tail light. And my patient's prone to being upset. He's an easy guy to get angry. It was, and it was interesting because in the situation, he said he came out and he was furious, and he's like, I'm getting ready to yell and scream. And he said it was interesting because the guy was like, oh, I'm so sorry. He's like, I worked an all night shift. He said, I think I dozed off and I bumped your car. And my patient really quickly kind of rather than kind of increasing the conflict, he went, oh my gosh, are you okay? Like, I know how that is to be so tired that you fell asleep. And he brought himself down by that. But what the interesting part was, he's like, as he came out yelling, the other guy, you could see his anxiety going up. But as soon as he stopped and kind of went, okay, gosh, I understand it. I've been there also. He's like, it was a bad situation that we both got out of with his anxiety came down. My anger came down only because he said, I understood. And the guy went, listen, I know why you're upset. Like this is terrible that I hit your car. And it was just this back and forth. And he said, yeah, at the end of the day, we resolved it. My car's going to get fixed. It wasn't a big deal. What would have happened if he kept heightened? He's like, and his anxiety went up. It was kind of an interesting thing to listen, like him using a form of active listening and just kind of understanding after being heightened at first, how it just brought the situation down to something manageable. I bring it up because that's not the history for this person. He's been in fist fights on the side of the road. And something that simple just kind of, eased it. So back to the idea that just listening and actively reflecting back can be important.
And I think it's such a valuable tool or lesson or both to try to implement. And I would really try to encourage, our audience to, next time you're in a conflict or even just like in a moment when someone's sharing something, really try to actively listen and see the response there and how that differs. And I think it can be a great tool to just share like, hey, this is what I'm hearing. Does it feel right? And I can think of, there's a client that I have, and this is not a practice in action, so don't want to get too therapy specific here, but who he's a senior, he's going to be a senior in high school, so kind of finishing up his junior year here. Had a pretty significant conflict with his parents, and we were talking about this, and I was reviewing this idea of active listening with him, and he kind of was just like, yeah, no, sure, I guess I can give it a try, and I was like, all right, well, hey, let's practice this here. I was like, your parents are in the session, so we can't actively listen to them, but let me actively listen to you. And let me see if I can get it down to the point where you say, yes, that is my stance. That is my take. That is where I'm coming from with this. And he kind of he agreed, but it was kind of like one of those eye rolling agreeances. And as I'm going through and sharing my understanding and hearing his piece of it and not trying to then play both sides and say, but your parents are saying this, but just attending to his experience and where he's coming from. At the end, he's like, Yeah. No, that's it. That's exactly and like his energy changed, his investment changed. And like, that's the point of he's bought in, where before it was a bit more of a, so a bit opposite there was maybe a lack of engagement, a lack of interest to now it's oh, hey, this can work. Like I'm feeling heard, and I'm like, that's then kind of having me primed. And when we tried to kind of do the same with his parents based off of what they like his, what he shared in there, and like trying to have him have that same skill and being able to do that. And so, things are much better now because he's been trying to practice and implement that. So I think it can be something that can pull back stronger emotions or can evoke certain emotions that have us bought in, to be willing to engage. So it not only calms, but it can also energize as well. But I think both in healthier directions. Yeah.
And I like that you brought up to encourage people to really try this just on a daily basis. When you said that, it kind of reminded me there's I'm an old sitcom person, but Everybody Loves Raymond has this episode where he and his wife are trying to learn some parenting strategies, and his daughter's just in one of those phases of development where she's just arguing all the time. And he learns active listening, and he's like shocked, like there's this magical, because she'll be yelling and he'll go, oh, so you're saying this. And it's kind of a funny episode. So, yeah, I mean, I don't care if it's with people's kids at work, whatever, practicing it when you're not in conflict is as important to be able to use it when you are in conflict. So, yeah, I think it's a great piece. The other piece I would kind of add to this is if both people at the table are willing, I think identifying what the common goal is, like what are we really, most times we're trying to reach a similar kind of outcome. And there was a book, I'm going to say it's probably 15 years old, maybe not quite that. It was called The 1 Minute Negotiator, and it was by two authors, Dawn Hudson and George Lucas, not the George Lucas, but the other George Lucas. And it was interesting because the whole first part of the book is this idea of, in a conflict or a disagreement, to just actually call out like, hey, we both this is what we're trying to achieve. And trying to name what that common goal is that you're trying to kind of come to an agreement on. And I think that's an important part in conflict resolution, is to try to find out what is that common goal in place that you can kind of work toward. I think identifying it and calling it out, I think sometimes important.
It's kind of that compass, to go back to our problem solving episode here. Like it's the compass that says, this is why we're here. This is what we're looking for. And I feel like so often when I'm, again, personally or professionally, have, individuals that are coming to the table, like both are wanting to come to the table. They're just having a difficult time connecting. I'm kind of try to use the imagery of like, we're kind of like, train tracks right now. We're parallel, but we're not then going to find an intersection there. So we have to be able to have some flexibility. We can't be so rigid that neither of us are willing to move. And even if one person's a little bit more flexible than the other, but it takes effort on both parts, I think, to be able to, find that resolution. Because if I'm only viewing it in this particular way, and yes, I want to reach this common goal. This common goal isn't in the purview of my rigid viewpoint of this situation. And if the other person's in a similar, we can train tracks. We can just go on for miles and miles and miles, or we can stop and take a moment and say, how do we not exist in just this parallel world? And even if we're creating just the slightest angle, going from that, those straight, parallel lines to the slightest angle, we're going to have a convergence point. Might be down the road, but we will get there. And I try to talk to people, how steep that angle is how flexible we're willing to be. And some people are willing to be a 90-degree angle. I'm just going to go over and meet you. I don't know that that's always the healthiest or the most helpful, because it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to inspire change. But if we can create this recognition of, hey, sometimes I'm wanting to be flexible, sometimes I'm not, but both individuals are willing to do that, I think that's going to create a better environment for conflict resolution.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting. I think sometimes when we think about trying to come to that point of, goal or or convergence. Sometimes we think that's hard. Like it's easy if my wife and I are arguing about who's going to do the dishes. There's a goal that's really easy to identify in that situation. But what if it is something as abstract as we have family members with different political views that can't be at Thanksgiving because the topic comes up and everything blows up. That's harder. And it's interesting. I mentioned I feel I'm always lucky that I have friends with different views, and I appreciate that about them. I think that's what makes us better as friends. It's interesting. A really close friend of mine who I don't get to see often. Politics is always a conversation, so I'm going to use him as an example for that. And it was interesting because I think early in our relationship, there were some heated arguments, and it was great because at one point we were talking, and he's just a really brilliant guy, and he said to me, listen, this isn't personal. I kind of went like, wow, no, I feel like you're kind of attacking kind of my views on things. And he goes, no, you got to keep in mind, our goal of talking about this stuff is not to change each other's mind. It's to have an intellectual conversation to help each other understand different worldviews. And I went, what? Like that's how that's, he's like, yeah, I don't want you to change your view, but I want to have a conversation that helps you think about things differently. That stay true to who you are. And I kind of went, wow, that's an interesting goal. And since then, him and with all of my other people I talk to, we can have these wonderful debates. And because the goal's not to try to change, I don't want them to think like I do, but I want them to maybe understand things or to help them think a little differently about it. Stay true to who you are, but maybe at least expand your thoughts. It never gets heated till it's a problem. And I've had individuals that I've worked with who say, man, dealing with family conflicts are so hard. And I use that example and I say, but is it hard because your goal's wrong? You're not going to change your Republican or Democratic, whatever side they are, uncle to change political parties at Thanksgiving dinner. And if that's your goal, you will have a conflict. But if your goal is to have an intellectual discussion and to see each other's points of view and to try to understand them, and that's as simple of a very slight convergence, maybe it's 50 years before your points converge completely, but it is pointing in the right direction. And it's interesting because when I've had people who have used that with family and they go, wow, it's much easier when my goal is to understand their point and to try to help them understand mine and not to change who they are, to change their opinion. So our goal might be really broad and it's a very narrow, that convergence isn't a very sharp angle, but still worth it. That I've set.
And I think that's the point of, we need to be willing to take that approach that says, I'm not going to try to change your belief systems in the singular moment. And that's going to be the way I don't experience that. But we need to have a respect for one another that says, hey, if you have those belief systems, I need you to be able to put those aside for us to be able to interact, in these specific ways. Right. And, that's the way that, it's not, I'm viewing you as a bad person. I'm saying that what you're doing right now makes me feel uncomfortable, or I'm not able to tolerate this. And so it's kind of the rules for engagement in a sense. And if we're able to approach that openly and have a conversation, I think it creates a better opportunity for resolution. And so we need to be flexible in our perception of, who we're engaging in this conflict with, but also flexible for ourselves and what our expectations are, and being able to then set realistic goals that allow us to then, make those slight adjustments and maybe over time reach the full resolution, but making smaller conflict resolution moments as we go. Because I think, that might make for a successful Thanksgiving dinner if it's as respectfully as possible. if you're using that language, I'm not going to be able to be here. And I want to be here and I want you to be here. So can we exist in the same space without?
There's difference in discussing intellectual content and making disparaging remarks.
Yes.
And that's kind of my boundary. I tell people, I'm like, I'll talk to you about controversial topics all day long. In fact, I kind of thrive off of it. I love that debate. But that doesn't mean you can belittle people. That doesn't mean you can use names and words that I'm not comfortable with. But if you want to talk about the content, let's do that. Let's have a realistic debate and conflict. And we're not going to maybe move the needle too far, but we'll at least have a conversation. But when it becomes something that is language and remarks that I'm not comfortable with, that's the boundary for me.
And I think being able to assess what the purpose is. Is the purpose to be, to share information, or is the purpose to be hurtful? And I think, that ends up being a pretty good compass of when do we engage and when do we not?
Oh, and I think back to the idea that there's some good parts to conflict. I've learned a lot about things that I didn't know about because of uncomfortable conversations. So again, if we're going to, no matter what the conflict is, if it's something, that is the kind of a social topic where we're, that is an uncomfortable topic, that's okay. Conflict. And again, listening, boundaries, all of that together kind of really is what will help us manage it in the right way.
And I want to kind of steer us back into that conversation, like if it's with a partner, if it's with a friend, and if we're experiencing that discomfort in a differing, a different perception of, how something should happen or what feels tolerable for us. Like, I think one of the biggest pieces that I try to work with people is that if it was easy or comfortable, we wouldn't be experiencing the conflict. So often we have to step outside into that, growth zone of if I'm thinking of zones of comfort, we have to step outside into that growth zone. And it's usually the uncomfortable thing that we're kind of dreading doing that's going to bring resolution. Not overstepping, it's not creating this drastic change in ourselves, but being willing to take a step into that uncomfortable area and being vulnerable enough with those people that I don't know that vulnerability is always necessary, but I think being vulnerable with ourselves to say, let me be open and let me do this action, or let me pull back from this, this expectation enough to be flexible. And I think a lot of times people resonate with that. And so it's usually doing that uncomfortable thing that starts the resolution, I think.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say not much conflict resolution is comfortable.
Yeah.
It's so, and that's okay. Like, it's still how we come often to the best outcome and the best resolution. Yeah. I guess as we're kind of wrapping up, we should maybe end about what do we do when the other person's inflexible and they're willing to resolve conflicts? Because the reality is, we're talking about things where everybody's at least willing to be at the table and to talk. And even if it is something as a really heavy topic, what we've talked about so far only works when the other person's willing to respect those boundaries. And unfortunately, that's not always the case. So, Paul, what's your thoughts? So what do we do when it is something where you're willing to resolve the conflict and the other person just isn't?
And we haven't made the episode yet, but I think that this falls under the purview of acceptance. And so being able to accept that desired outcome or that desired goal that at least I as an individual have isn't probably going to be the one that's reached. And so then being able to be able to kind of renegotiate or reconceptualize for myself, what am I able to control in this? And so if it's that person that makes me feel uncomfortable at Thanksgiving dinner, conflict resolution might be me actively deciding, hey, I'm trying to resolve this and it's not happening. And I'm trying to do this, but it doesn't feel like I'm being respected. And so I'm going to make the best choice for me. And that best choice might be that I'm not going to be there, or it might be that I'm going to be there in a limited capacity, or, making arrangements to not. And I think that's different from outright avoidance, because it's an active choice. We go and we hit a wall, and in that wall, we're deciding I'm not going to continue to try to push through and exhaust myself or create that resentment and frustration. Let me try to practice acceptance and saying, hey, I'm trying to be flexible, and this other individual, for whatever the reasons, is not. So in my flexibility, what is the next best thing? And it might be I'm able to have a not conflict free, but maybe a conflict reduced Thanksgiving dinner, or maybe I'm able to go and find other, family or friends that I'm able to do this with, and being creative with our problem solving with it. But I think a part of it is we have to be able to differ in our expectations of what's going to move forward with it. And I think not feeling challenging feelings of guilt or challenging feelings of, especially when it comes to family, like there is such a pressure of, hey, you need to be, blood is thicker than water. So, you need to always be good with your family. And that just doesn't ring true most of the time. Family is one of the most common areas where I hear about these conflicts, and being able to say, hey, can it be okay that we're not, that we don't really get along? Can it be okay that we're not going to exist in the same space, and that there might be some unwillingness to budge? And how do we try to, as individuals, do what we think is best for ourselves and challenge that potential guilt that's there? We've tried, it didn't work. Is that the permission enough that we need to then not linger on that too heavily?
Yeah, and I think it is difficult. I think this idea of how do we accept it and move forward with accepting the fact it won't be resolved, that's not always easy, but it's, I always go back to, the old saying that the only person's behavior we can control is our own.
Mm-hmm.
And that, we have to think of what's the effort that we're going to put forth. And, I know for me personally, I'll often kind of go, all right, when's the point that I have to let this go? And I still think I think acceptance is still resolution. Maybe it's one-sided resolution for myself, but for me to say, okay, I can't put myself in that situation because I've made an attempt to change. So I'll go back to the situation that you gave with, somebody maybe making racial comments. I'm going to take my approach and say, listen, this can't happen. Here's my boundary. Willing to talk about content, not willing to go into, if you're going to do X, Y, and Z, I'm not willing to engage in that way. And if it doesn't change over, maybe I say 2 times or 3 times, whatever in my head I come to, then I have to be comfortable enough to remove myself from that situation and say, I'm not going to engage in that because it's just toxic in general for myself. And so, it's a hard decision. And it is so hard with family members. But, there are times that we can try to negotiate. We can try to come up with some common goals to resolve the conflict. It just doesn't happen. And, I always, for myself and for other people, will say, know that going into the resolution. So I don't ever make those decisions emotionally. So, if it's not going well and you're frustrated and you go, I'm done, I'm never talking to this person again. I don't know. That's not a resolution. That's a reaction. Yeah. But to say, here's how far I'm willing to go, and here's what I'm willing to try, and what am I willing to do in this situation. And if that doesn't play forward, and I'm putting, I think, everything that I can do flexibility wise on my part, then I know that ahead of time. It's not a reaction. It's a proactive way to look at it. That's hard sometimes to do and to plan through. But I think for those, bigger kind of conflicts, we can do that. And even with just daily conflicts, I mean, there's a point where I think I know my own kind of tolerance ahead of time to say, this is when I'm just going to step away from it, and I'm not going to go forward.
I think that like knowing your tolerance, I think is probably one of the biggest pieces in it. It really kind of challenges ourselves to say, how well do I know myself? How well do I know, again, what I'm willing to take, what I'm willing to not, and then I'm not leaving it up to, to figuring it out in the moment, but having that rough outline. And so, if I'm thinking of like those major points for today, like I think active listening is, such an important piece of that. If we can have common goals, or at least as in identifying our own goal. Like it's great if we have a common goal, but just knowing what our goal is. And if it can be a common goal, striving for that. But when it's difficult, when we're aware of our tolerance of what we're willing to take and what we're not, that might take the idea of a common goal out of the equation. And then we have to then adjust our goal and maybe saying, how do I take care of myself? And how do I not then continue to engage in toxic relationships or negativity? But let me make sure that I'm not doing that too hastily either. It's not just a reaction, but it's a healthy decision.
Yeah. And I guess maybe I'll kind of conclude with this idea. And we didn't say this early on, but I think all good conflict resolution occurs without too much emotion put into it. And it sounds weird when we're talking about something like conflict that's emotionally driven. But if you're in conflict with someone, it is also okay to take a break for a second and step away and say, hey, we're not going to resolve this today. Mm-hmm. And us just butting heads today is not a good idea because maybe we're both too emotional. And to step back and, take a time out or whatever we want to call it and come back to the table later and talk. I've done that with my kids, it's been like, hey, listen, we're not getting anywhere and we're not going to because I'm upset, you're upset. That's not ever going to be good decision making. We're going to table this till tomorrow. And then we come back and then we're both maybe a little bit more level headed, for lack of a better word. And we can decide these things cognitively versus emotionally. And so, we didn't say that earlier, but I think no matter if it's we're going to accept the fact that we're not going to be able to move forward, or we're going to collaboratively work together to solve the conflict, doing it with a level head and not making emotional reactions and giving ourselves a break to think through is maybe an important part we should have brought up earlier, but we're going to end with that.
And I love that idea. Like, in some ways, if we can communicate our emotions rather than the expression of them driving the community, like driving the interaction. So it's not a yelling, it's I'm sharing why this is really aggravating and frustrating to me. So that communication piece, I think, is such an important element. And I think, emotion has a role, but it can't be the only thing that's there driving the bus. And in fact, like having some of that cognitive, rational thinking, it ends up that's what really can allow us to connect.
Well, and you're right. It's okay to express your emotion, but I'll say in my own life, and I would say probably most people have had this experience, what my emotion is at the initial moment of conflict isn't reflective of what the real emotion is. Where, a lot of times in conflict, we're either going to be anxious or angry. We're fight or flight at that point. Like that's how it's manifesting, but my actual emotion may be that I'm disappointed in the situation, or maybe but that doesn't come out until I step away for a second and it's not as emotionally charged. And then I can say, my reaction to this situation was because I was really disappointed in how this situation unfolded. And that led to me responding in this way versus just coming with that emotional intensity. So sometimes that step away lets us really be in touch in what really is bothering us. Like, did it make us anxious? Did it really make us sad? Are we disappointed in the situation? Are we feeling guilty about our own response? And there is a cataclysm of emotions that can be in any conflict. But the initial phase we often will see is fight or flight.
Yeah.
And so that's why I said that stepping away will then let us really express what our real emotion is versus just the reaction.
Yeah, such an important piece. And I think, when we do it well, it gives us a better odds for conflict resolution. It's not a guarantee, but it helps.
Agree.
Well, and with that, we hope you enjoy this episode. Please check in next week. But until then, be well, stay psyched. The information contained in this podcast and on the Psyched to Practice website is intended for informational and educational purposes only. Nothing in this podcast or on the website is intended to be a substitute for professional, psychological, psychiatric, educational, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please note that no professional-patient relationship is formed here, and similarly, no supervisory or consultative relationship is formed between the host, guests, and listeners of this podcast. If you need the qualified advice of a mental health professional or practitioner, please contact services in your area. Similarly, if you need supervision on clinical matters, please locate a supervisor with experience to fit your professional needs.